Hello and welcome to another episode of the ITPro podcast, your weekly source for IT news and insight. My name's Adam Shepherd, reviews editor from ITPro.
And I'm Jane McCallion, features editor at ITPro.
So it's been something of a week. All of the news seems to have happened at the same time. There seems to be everything in the entire world going on this week.
Well, do you mean also everything in the entire world has happened within the past sort of 24 hours?
Well, yeah, that too. So just last night, in fact, Xerox announced that it was putting in a bid for HP. That's Hewlett-Packard, the printer and laptop and device manufacturer, for a total of $30 billion.
That is a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
And as I understand it, it's more than Xerox itself is worth. Do you think they'll go for it?
I think they might well do. HP hasn't been doing super well of late, so it's a distinct possibility. Also, aside from that, a £12.5 million fine, or I should say €14.5 million fine, was issued against a German housing giant for holding information in an archival system that they couldn't delete records from.
Yes, so they were holding on to tenants' information, and under GDPR you have to be able to identify and delete information on individuals, and they just couldn't do this. They were warned about it in 2017. So, yeah, they didn't get their act together, and they are literally paying the price for it.
GDPR fines finally starting to come down.
Indeed.
Aside from that, we've had VMware finally announcing what it's going to do with Carbon Black, which it acquired earlier this year. As they hinted at during VMworld US, they are going to roll Carbon Black's cloud endpoint defense protection into Dell's wider client device portfolio. So Carbon Black Cloud will be a kind of premier partner for protecting Dell laptops and devices protected by SecureWorks.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me, although Dell has a funny relationship with security, so obviously it still has SecureWorks, but it used to have SonicWall, which it spun off, and now via VMware, which is a partly owned subsidiary, it now has Carbon Black on board, so it's all a bit all over the place in terms of security, but, yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
It's going to be interesting to see what they do with it on the enterprise side, because they were also talking about building it into vSphere, which I think is probably going to be the more significant development product-wise. Also, there is something related to what we were talking about in last week's podcast with Graham Cluley and Stu Peck vis-a-vis the kind of inflated importance of 0 days. Tenable's VP of Intelligence, Gavin Millard, has said that basically security teams need to worry about vulnerabilities in Flash and Internet Explorer rather than quote-unquote sexy 0 days, which is pretty much the conclusion we arrived at last week.
Yeah, I think 0 days sound fancy. They sound dangerous. They are dangerous, but they're dangerous in the same way that great white shark attacks are dangerous. Very much the same way. Super dangerous, really quite rare.
Yeah, exactly. That's some of the news that's been going on this week, but it's not any of our main stories.
No, it's not.
Our first main story is actually something delightfully wholesome for a change, which is the news that Avast, the antivirus company, has partnered with that venerable organisation, the Neighbourhood Watch, to create the Cyberhood Watch scheme, which is kind of adorable, but also just really actually quite useful and valuable.
Yeah, I mean, same. It's probably my favourite story of the week, just from a kind of how, let's say, wholesome, how quaint, I guess it is. You don't really hear very much about Neighbourhood Watch, let alone the fact that they are now turning their attention to cyber. But it does make sense. Consumers are supposed to be understanding more about cybersecurity, and such a well-established organisation as Neighbourhood Watch getting in on the act means that everybody isn't reliant on either cybersecurity vendors who, as mentioned, perhaps have a vested interest in making you afraid, or Barclays.
So this partnership is Avast working with the Neighbourhood Watch organisation to basically upskill communities in cybersecurity. A survey of 14,000 Neighbourhood Watch members revealed that over a third were more concerned about cybercrime than physical crime, And 1 in 5 of those members have, in fact, been a victim of cybercrime.
I can believe that, actually. I've been targeted by cybercrime quite a lot of times. In general, they haven't managed to get anywhere because of my job. Yeah, because of my job and, behind the scenes look for listeners that I used to lead cybersecurity on ITPro, as that was my beat. So yeah, you'd hope that they wouldn't manage to nab me. On the other hand, we've been targeted by actual criminals once in the over 10 years that I've lived where I live. So had I fallen for anything, I would have been a victim multiple times of cyber security problems.
And also bear in mind that the people who are most likely to be members of the Neighbourhood Watch are, older people who aren't necessarily as kind of digitally savvy as other people, and people who are kind of living in slightly more rural communities. People, in other words, who would ordinarily make the easiest pickings for cyber criminals. So it makes sense to kind of upskill those people as much as possible.
Agreed.
So Avast is going to be contributing training processes. They're going to be offering accreditation for Neighbourhood Watch representatives in security. They're going to be putting on education events in local communities and offering information and downloadable resources. And I just think it's lovely. It's a lovely initiative. I think it's going to have big benefits for those communities, and it's just a nice example of proper, genuine community outreach.
Yeah, all the best to them. I hope it goes well.
Me too. One security story that isn't quite as wholesome as this is the news that a Trend Micro employee has been discovered as selling the data of 70,000 of Trend Micro's customers to criminal or criminals unknown.
Yeah, so this is consumer customers, so individuals rather than companies, isn't it?
Yeah, so business customers, enterprise customers, government customers are all unaffected by this. It's a separate consumer support database which was targeted.
But that isn't to say that it's not serious by any stretch of the imagination, especially not for those 70,000 people.
Yeah, quite.
And presumably it's probably easier to get personally identifiable information from the consumer side than from businesses anyway. I mean, I think this comes back to what we were talking about last week, what we talked about just now, about what the real cyber threats are. Insider threats are a real threat to people who may be targeted, to companies themselves. I know of a company where an insider tried to make off with a hard drive full of intellectual property. And
what, like an actual hard drive?
An actual hard drive full of IP, and were stopped as they were about to board a plane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a cool story.
That's extremely Mission Impossible.
Yeah, well, indeed, completely impossible because they were stopped. But, insiders are a far more serious threat than sort of 0 days. This demonstrates it. Repeated other news stories demonstrate it.
Yeah, as ITPro panellist and Domino's UK Chief Information Security Officer Paul Watts pointed out, it's a perfect example of what happens when you focus all your energy on protecting the perimeter of your fortress without considering the potential enemy from within. It's never an easy conversation to have, but when it comes to insider threats in your business, trust isn't enough to manage the risks to any level of adequacy. Moving on to our third story of this week. Our colleague and deputy editor Dale Walker has been out in Orlando at Microsoft Ignite this week.
Yes, he has. The company's annual conference. There have been a lot.
Well, one of the company's annual conferences, we should say, because they have about 6 by my count.
Yes, Ignite being one of Microsoft's annual conferences. And there has been a lot of news coming out of it. But on this particular point, we are talking about Azure Arc, which is Microsoft's platform for sort of managing multi-cloud, on-premise, edge, very much cottoning on to this hybrid multi-trend that is going on at the moment.
It's essentially consolidating as many of Microsoft's cloud management tools as possible into a single pane of glass style management console, and basically allows IT admins to apply tools like Azure Shell, APIs, resource management tools across their entire cloud estate, whether that's in Microsoft's Azure cloud or running on on-prem data centers.
Yeah, I mean, multi-cloud and hybrid cloud are the two big cloud trends. I think that's probably where things are going to settle. Our colleague Roland Moore-Collier recently wrote an explainer of multi-cloud, but it's pretty much where you want to use a little bit of this cloud over here, so a little bit of Azure, maybe a little bit of AWS, dare I say, a little bit of Google Cloud, plus keep some things on-premise as well with a hybrid attitude. It is where cloud has ended up, but nobody really knew what was going to happen. A lot of people thought that things were going to go full public, say, 7 years ago, and it's become evident in the past, say, 5 years that this hybrid multi attitude is where things are going to be, especially for larger businesses.
If I was Bezos, I would be a little bit worried about Microsoft eating my cloudy lunch, as it were.
I mean, it very much plays into Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO's motto of cloud first, mobile first. More of the cloud first than the mobile first, to be fair.
I would disagree with that, actually.
Really?
Yeah. I would say this isn't necessarily an example of cloud first. I would say this is more an example of cloud and. And that sounds, you're making a face at me, because it sounds like a horrible marketing buzzword.
I would say it sounds like you're about to announce your resignation. You're off to go and work for Microsoft. Is that sounds?
No, hear me out. If you're looking at cloud first and cloud capabilities and cloud native stuff, AWS is still the market leader in that. But where Microsoft is excelling is going, okay, you've got your Azure stuff, you've got workloads running in the cloud, you've got various, virtualized network functions running in Azure, but you've still got a load of on-prem stuff, and you've still got a bunch of legacy stuff, and you've got stuff that, for whatever reason, doesn't want to go into the cloud. Maybe it's too expensive to put into the cloud. Maybe you just can't be asked with porting it over. That's fine. We're going to give you a bunch of tools and a bunch of capabilities that allow you to manage that without having to flip between 4 or 5 different tools and orchestration layers. Right. With that deluge of news out of the way, we are going to keep on the Windows theme, and we are going to be talking about the past 5 years of Windows 10, Microsoft's forever OS. We're going to be joined by a very special guest from the ITPro podcast.
All that coming up after a short break.
Hello, I'm Ollie Mann, and every Friday on The Week Unwrapped, we cover the stories you might have missed with journalists from theweek.co.uk. It's all the big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. That's The Week Unwrapped with me, Ollie Mann, available now for free from all good podcast apps.
Welcome back. We are joined by Darien Graham-Smith.
Hello there.
Long-running contributor to the ITPro podcast and ITPro associate editor. Darien, welcome to the show.
It's lovely to be here.
Today we are talking about Windows 10.
Oh yes, a subject I have some opinions about.
Yes, I thought you might. It has been 5 years since the first preview of Windows 10 was released from Redmond HQ. And we have been living with it since then.
In some ways it seems like a lot more than 5 years. In other ways it seems like less, because this is, I think you described it earlier as something like Microsoft's never-ending operating system, the operating system for life, not just for Christmas kind of thing, because it's still Windows 10 today. But it is a very different beast to what it was in 2014 when we first got our hands on the preview releases. And so we've had a very strange relationship with Windows 10. It's, if you don't like Windows 10, never mind, a different Windows 10 will be along in 6 months' time.
Well, quite. One thing I do like about Windows 10 actually is that kind of continually refreshing feature set. It's not like macOS, to pick the most obvious example, where it's only every year and change that you get any new features added. It is kind of like, oh, every couple of months I go, oh, there's a new thing. I don't remember that being there the last time I checked.
Well, yes. As an over 40-year-old, I do sometimes nowadays get that sort of sense of they've changed my operating system. I liked it the way it was. Well, this is a genuine issue though. I mean, with Windows 10, sometimes, for example, the constant move to gradually migrate everything from the old Windows 7 style interface to the new. Are they calling it Fluent now, or whatever? But it's had a million names: the Metro style, the modern style, the whatever you want to call it. So it is actually a genuine issue that you'll come back to your computer one day and things won't be where they were. And that's obviously coming from a perspective as a consumer, as an individual. I guess a lot of people listening to this podcast will be in business, and from a support perspective, that's an absolute nightmare.
Yep.
Of course, there are the multiple strands of Windows 10, so you can sign up for the LTSB, long-term service branch, is that right? And all that stuff. You can do that. But, it's a little bit annoying that you have to. Windows 10 is kind of, in one sense, the gift that gives on giving, and in another sense, it's the wheel that won't stop squeaking.
I mean, we were talking off mic about how it's sort of the DevOps of operating systems, or rather an operating system in a DevOps kind of delivery, that it is constantly being improved upon, constant development, which... Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how well this works from an end user point of view if things are constantly changing. Humans just aren't, we're not built for constant change. We like things to stay the same at least for a while. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's part of the reason why people clung on to XP, people have been clinging on to Windows 7, especially in business environments.
People clung on to Windows XP because it is, in fact, the greatest operating system devised by man.
It's not even the best version of Windows that came out between 1999 and 2005.
I'm sorry, I'm a Windows XP stan. I will die on this hill.
Well, I mean, I'm not particularly a Windows user, although I'm sure we'll kind of come on to my love of Windows Mobile later on. But I recognise the XP startup noise. I heard a self-checkout starting one time behind me in a shop, and I was like, it's Windows XP. Windows XP is behind me.
Well, Windows XP did hang around for a very long time. I mean, it's. I think it still wears the crown for the longest surviving. I mean, it's properly, officially dead now. Although, as you say, you do still see it.
Windows 10 actually became the most popular desktop OS only fairly recently, surpassing 7 and XP. That was only in January this year, fairly long after both XP and 7 went end of life officially.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, from Microsoft's perspective, Windows is one of its key products and it wants to keep on innovating and updating and keep it in the spotlight and so on. But from the perspective of many of the businesses that are actually running it, it's infrastructure. And if it works, if your key line of business apps work on Windows XP, why would you upgrade?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Precisely.
The problem is, it is broke. I mean, WannaCry is a key example, and I know many of our listeners will have groaned at the mere mention of it at this point. But it's a good example. Windows XP is no longer supported. There are bits of it that are broken from a security perspective, and just because you, as a business owner or as an IT admin, your Windows XP bit does the thing that you need it to do, doesn't mean it's fit for purpose in a wider business context. I mean, you were saying that Windows XP still has a big footprint in various places, things like point of sale systems, ATMs, embedded devices of various kinds. That was a large part of why the NHS was affected so badly, is because there are things like hospital equipment, X-ray machines and whatnot that use embedded versions of Windows XP that cannot be updated. There is no mechanism for doing so. It's
a two-way problem that, yes, the software for some of the big hardware will only work with XP because, an MRI machine to a great extent is an MRI machine. You don't need to make a new application or command system for that all the time. And yeah, sometimes XP will only work with certain things as well. And that's what you get when you get something that was in place for as long as XP was.
Although this will shock you, but I'm actually not an expert on hospital hardware. But it would seem likely, just based on what you've just said, that the reason that an MRI machine or any kind of proprietary hardware might only work with XP and not with more recent editions of Windows is precisely because with Vista, new security models were introduced. And so it is necessary, I think, for the security security to be broken in a particular way in order for that hardware to function.
Yeah. Also, you don't refresh your hospital hardware every sort of 5 years or something like that. I think once your MRI or your CAT scanner or X-ray is installed, it's going to be there for a while.
Yep.
Fully welcome, actually, to hear from any listeners who know more about this than us three who do not work in hospitals. We are a podcast at itpro.co.uk. So, yes, we would love to hear from you.
But this brings us actually quite neatly on to one of the main kind of thrusts of what I wanted to talk about this week, which is there's a lot of businesses, and not just businesses with embedded devices like MRI machines or self-checkout machines or ATMs or what have you, that are still steadfastly refusing to upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10.
Windows 7 stops receiving mainstream support very soon. In fact, it stopped receiving mainstream support. It stops receiving extended support very soon.
Yes, in January of next year.
Which is alarmingly close.
Yeah, we have a lot on the site of advice about how to deal with a Windows 7 upgrade if you've not already started to make your migration. Now is your time. We will, in the show notes, link to some of that content. So some help there if you are trying to deal with this situation.
It's also worth being clear that, I mean, if you've been in IT management a long time, you'll be very, very wary of upgrading versions of Windows in place for all sorts of reasons. But one thing you can say for Windows 10 is that if you've got a machine that Windows 7 runs smoothly on today, Windows 10 will run acceptably at worst on it and probably run absolutely fine. For once, they didn't massively ramp up the hardware requirements, not like XP to Vista, which was a genuine...
Oh my God.
Yeah, exactly. So, Microsoft is investing an enormous amount of time and money into constantly updating Windows 10 as per its promise. And to be fair, it is doing that. And what's it actually getting back in exchange for this?
I think the direction now, which you touched on earlier, Jane, is now cloud first and to a lesser extent mobile first. I think Windows 10 is going to become the bedrock of Azure management. I think it won't be too long at all before we start to see a lot of Azure management capabilities baked into Windows through things like PowerShell.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, OneDrive has already become an integral part of even the consumer SKUs, I think. And I don't think this has come down the line with a regular Windows 10 update, but every time I see a new laptop, it's got Office 365 pre-installed on it. So they are finding avenues of using Windows as the bedrock of paying services.
Do you think we're going to see a Windows 11?
Not soon, but I would not be surprised if, in 5 years' time or something, there has been something. They wouldn't brand it Windows 11, I think. I think they'd come up with a new name for it.
Azure Desktop.
Well, possibly
having that one for free, guys.
Plausible.
Yeah. I wouldn't give that away for free if I were you. You know how much Azure's worth?
Copyrighted, guys. Send me the check. Adam, you are using a Windows device right now. Darien, I know that you're a Windows user as well. And I'm an occasional Windows user at home.
Just a social Windows user.
Less than even. But do you like Windows 10?
Yeah, I do like it. I mean, one of the things that we haven't mentioned is that when it came along in 2014, there was an enormous kind of collective sigh of relief, because until that moment it had seemed that Microsoft was really set on the Windows 8 way of doing things.
Oh God, I remember that.
Yeah, businesses in particular, I think, were just pulling their hair out going, really, you expect us to roll this out, this less than half-baked tablet first for hardware that doesn't exist kind of crazy conception of the future. It was and it felt unfinished in so many ways.
Oh my God.
And yeah,
I was fine with Windows 8 because I was a Windows Mobile user for so many years. It was Windows Mobile but on a larger screen. But I'm not a business, and like I said, you'll be amazed to hear. And I already was very much within that ecosystem, which was unusual. Yeah,
it's certainly not usual in a corporate context.
No, and I wouldn't have liked it as a business.
No. So when Microsoft came out with something which had the start menu back and looked and works just a little bit more like the Windows 7 that businesses still love, as we mentioned.
The thing with Windows 8.1, just to go back to that briefly, is, as you mentioned, it was built for a form factor that didn't really exist, and to a large extent doesn't exist now. I mean, tablets and turn ones and convertibles are out there and have been for ages, but they're far from the norm.
No, it drives me mad actually a bit that Microsoft, they're not exactly pushing this kind of, completely la-la land fantasy anymore, but you've got in front of you a Surface Pro, I believe.
Yes, the Surface Pro 7, in fact.
And it's a very nice machine. But when you buy it, the headline price does not include a keyboard.
No.
There's still this idea that somebody in the world is going to use Windows without a keyboard, and it's a fiction.
Having said that, I can see businesses using it without a keyboard, particularly in the sense of as an employee companion.
Yeah, so carry around.
Exactly. Yeah. Carry it around the shop floor or the warehouse or whatever, and you've got your custom built, ERP, stock control app or whatever, and you're tapping away. That I can maybe just about see. No consumer is going to use it without the keyboard.
And even even what you're describing is a niche within.
Incredibly niche.
So the idea of making that like the keystone of an operating system, and even now, I think Microsoft is, to be fair, when Satya Nadella took over from Steve Ballmer, there seemed to be like an enormous injection of common sense.
Oh my God!
Still, I think they're slightly in denial about some things about touch.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a case of turning around an oil tanker a bit? It's a big company. It was going in this direction. You get a new captain, who is Satya, and you if he wants to turn in another direction, you kind of have to carry on in the general vector of where it was going in order to make those changes without just breaking everything.
Well, I think it's a case of changing it bit by bit.
Well, I mean, things like the Surface laptop, which I use myself, is not really in any sense a Surface device, except that it has a touch screen. Maybe, as I say, that common sense, maybe that is has filtered down into the product side of things in a way that I think Steve Ballmer might not have been so eager to embrace. Maybe what's changed more in the past 5 years isn't Windows, but Microsoft itself.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Also, the landscape, very much the kind of 2010s and latter half of 2010s thing is partnership.
Yeah.
I have been to more conferences than I can put down now off the top of my head where Satya Nadella has popped up or another partner has popped up, and there are still big rivalries out there. But there are a lot of partnerships as well, and that kind of cross-platform, everyone working together and acknowledging that people want to use a bit of a pick and mix of tech, whether you are a consumer or business or both parts of your life. This is what BYOD is about, and you've got to move with the times.
Here's something. Speaking of that, here's something that blew my mind. Earlier this year when I was at Dell Technologies World in Las Vegas. Pat Gelsinger, CEO of VMware.
I remember him.
Yes, don't you? Pat Gelsinger, CEO of VMware. Michael Dell of Dell fame.
I remember him too, but that's less surprising.
Well, quite. And Satya Nadella all sharing a stage to announce that VMware was going to be natively available on Azure, which... Oh my God. Like, who 5 years, looking at the Microsoft of 5 years ago, who could have possibly predicted that not only would VMware be supported on its cloud system, but also that the CEO would be announcing it live on stage at what is effectively VMware's annual conference. Yeah. It's very much a different Microsoft. Okay, so sadly that's all we've got time for this week. Much as we could sit here for another hour and a half and rabbit on about Microsoft, we are going to have to leave it there. Darien, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you in the studio.
It's been a pleasure being here, thank you.
You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever else you get podcasts, and read more about what we've spoken today and everything else at itpro.co.uk.
You can email us at podcast@itpro.co.uk, and you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
We look forward to catching you next week. Bye.
Bye.